Welcome folks to this third webinar in our series of advances in weed management seminars sponsored by GRDC. My name's Mark Congreve from ICANN and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar today. Supporting me in the back end running the systems in our Sydney office is Erica Mackay, and we'll hear from Erica later when we get into the question time, but thanks for Erica for organising and running this webinar for us. Today we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Dale Shaner coming to us from Colorado. He's based in Colorado in USA. Before Dale retired earlier this year, he had had extensive experience with a number of multinational companies in the USDA, so he's got an excellent background understanding of molecules, herbicides, herbicide development, and how they interact with the environment. So what I've asked Dale to discuss this morning is the chemical properties of the various residual herbicides we're using in our winter cropping systems, what we know about those molecules from the chemical properties and how that influences their binding on soil, organic matter, stubble, etc., and therefore their availability to work for us as herbicides. I've asked Dale to focus on the main herbicides we're using in the winter cropping system, so Treflan, Sakura, Boxer Gold and Outlook will be the main focus of what we're talking about today. While I'm waiting for the rest of the people to dial into this webinar, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping and how to use the webinar software. On the right-hand side of your page, you should see a toolbar. A couple of things to point out with regard to that toolbar. About halfway down the page, there'll be a box which will be titled Chat or Questions. In that, you can type in any questions that you'd like to ask during the seminar. Now, we're expecting to have over 50 people, maybe up to 100 people on the webinar today, so all participants will be muted. We just get way too much background noise from mobile phones and hands-free kits and all that sort of stuff if you're not muted. So everybody will be on mute apart from who's speaking. So please type in your questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll come back to the questions and address them, and we can unmute you at that point in time if we need further clarification on your question. If you're having any technical glitches, there's a webinar code there. If you happen to drop out for any reason, the code on the screen, write that down, 159348531. You can reconnect by going to the joinwebinar.com website and entering that and following the links from there. Also, if you're having problems with audio, if the audio is coming via your computer and it's not very good for you and you want to connect via a telephone, if you go to the toolbar and towards the top of the toolbar, you'll see a button there which you can click on for telephone. That will bring up a 03 number and an access code. You can dial in and you'll get possibly better connection via your telephone than listening to it over the computer. The presentation today is planned to go for approximately 30 minutes and then we'll open it up for questions after that. So again, encourage asking any questions and we will address them at the end of the webinar. Other little bits of information, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the GRDC YouTube channel following this series of webinars being completed today. We'll also send out an email post the workshop with links to some of the information that was discussed in the slides. So you will get that as a follow-up. However, if there is something on a slide where you particularly want that information right now, at the top of your screen there's a little camera icon. If you happen to click on that camera icon during the presentation, a copy of the slide you're currently viewing will be saved to your desktop. So it's handy if there's any numbers or information that you actually want to capture right at this point in time. At this point in time, I'll introduce Dale. Thank Dale immensely for his time putting this presentation together and delivering it for us, as I mentioned, coming to us from Colorado in the snowy USA, and I am fairly jealous that I'm not over there with him. Probably be up on the slopes if I was. But anyway, at this point in time, I'll introduce and welcome Dale and hand the presentation over to Dale for the next 30 minutes or so. Thank you, Dale.
Dale, you have control now. Okay, thank you, Mark, and I want to thank Mark and GRDC for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So as Mark said, what I'm going to be talking about today are factors affecting the understanding the stubble and soil binding of pre-emergence herbicides that are used for ryegrass control in winter crops in Australia. My objectives of over the next 30 minutes is first to do a brief background of factors that affect herbicide-soil interactions and herbicide efficacy to kind of set the table, and then compare the physical-chemical characteristics of the 5 soil-applied herbicides, trifluralin, prosulfocarb, and metolachlor, which are both parts of boxer gold, dimethenamid, which is an outlook, and pyroxasulfone. Doing these comparisons, I will suggest how these characteristics affect the efficacies of these herbicides and how they bind to the soil, and what are the practical consequences of this herbicide-soil crop residue interaction in terms of using the herbicides most effectively. So first, this first slide just shows what happens to a herbicide once it's applied to the soil, and all of these factors are important in order to understand how the herbicide activity is affected. Once the herbicide is applied, multiple things can happen to it. It can be lost into the atmosphere by volatilization. It can be degraded by the sun through photodecomposition. It can be chemically broken down or microbially broken down in the soil. It can leach out of the soil profile, or it can interact with the soil organic matter and clay content. All of these interactions affect the total pool of herbicide, which is actually available for plant uptake and determines the herbicidal activity. And all of these different factors are important in order to understand the comparative behavior of these 5 herbicides. So one of the major factors that affect the fate of herbicides in the soil is their adsorption or interaction with the soil. And I just wanted to define a few terms. Adsorption really just is defined as an association of any molecule with the surface of a solid. And sorption requires, it means retention on or in a solid phase, and desorption has to do with the release of chemicals from a solid phase. So if we look at a model of a soil, this adsorbing particle, and a herbicide, they will, the herbicide that's applied to the soil and what's in the soil solution will reach an equilibrium between how much of the herbicide is bound to the soil and how much of the herbicide is free in the soil. And it is this concentration of the free herbicide or the herbicide in the soil water that determines its biological activity, both for degradation as well as plant uptake. Any herbicide that's tightly bound to the soil particle is really not available to the plant or to the soil microorganisms. It is this concentration also in the soil water that determines how rapidly it can leach out of the upper parts of the soil. What factors in affect sorption? Well, the properties of the soil colloids themselves affect the how much herbicide will bind to them, and these properties primarily are the organic matter and the clay content. The other properties that are factors that affect sorption is the solubility and the ionization properties of the herbicides. Since the 5 herbicides we're talking today are all non-ionizable, meaning they don't take either a positive or negative charge to them, it's really the solubility, the water solubility, that determines how much they're bound to the soil particles. The third factor is the amount of soil moisture, because the herbicide has to be in soil water in order to be effective. If there is no soil water, you're talking about a very, very dry soil, then the herbicides are not available to the plant. One of the major factors that affect herbicide efficacy, as I've talked, is about how much herbicide is available in the soil solution. And the primary factors that affect efficacy and this availability is the soil organic matter. The higher the soil organic matter, the more herbicide that's bound. And if you get into heavier and heavier soils with higher organic matter, you need more herbicide to be equivalent activity. This bottom slide here just shows the relationship between binding, which is designated here KD, and I'll define that shortly, and the soil organic matter. And this is a slide that I created looking at both metolachlor, dimethenamid, and pyroxasulfone. And all three of them show a similar trend. As the soil organic matter increases, their binding increases. The same thing is true for trifluralin prosulfocarb, although it's a much higher magnitude than what I'm showing in this particular. The other two factors, other two terms that you often hear related to adsorption are terms that we call KD and KOC. And what these are their indices of how tightly a herbicide, or a way to measure how tightly a herbicide is bound to the soil. KD is defined as the kilograms of herbicide bound per kilogram of soil divided by the kilograms of herbicide per liter of soil water. So it's a ratio. And the higher the ratio, the more the herbicides in the soil and the less in the water. The KOC is just the KD divided by the soil organic matter. And this term is often used as a way to normalize values across different soils. The higher the KOC, the more tightly bound the herbicide is to the soil organic carbon, or organic matter. The other factor that affects herbicide efficacy, as I already said, is this water solubility. The more water soluble a herbicide is, the more it's available to the plant. The higher water solubility, however, can also affect how rapidly the herbicide can leach or move in the soil, depending on how it binds to the soil. And when we talk about crop residue, the higher the water solubility means that it also reflects how easily that residue or that herbicide will wash away from the crop residue with rainfall. The third factor that I talked about is soil moisture. All herbicides require water for activation. In the absence of soil moisture, the herbicides essentially are inactive. What does this mean? That if the weed seed germinates below, so you have a very dry soil on the surface, but you have a moist soil underneath, if the weed seeds germinate in that moist soil, they can come up through a dry, treated soil and still not be controlled. And this is particularly true for the three herbicides, metolachlor, dimethenamid, and pyroxasulfone. This table that you see in the bottom is a study that was done in the greenhouse looking at grass control of pyroxasulfone versus metolachlor, and looking at what the effect of rainfall is in days after treatment. In this particular study, we set it up so that we had moist soil at the bottom of the pot, planted the seeds, and then covered it with dry soil, and then we applied simulated rainfall at either 0, 4, or 7 days after treatment. You can see that if the rainfall occurred at the day of treatment or even 4 days after treatment, we got very, very good activity. But if the rainfall was delayed to 7 days after treatment, the metolachlor was completely inactive because the weeds had come up through and were no longer affected, and the pyroxasulfone lost about 40% of its activity. So what this means is if you have a herbicide applied to a dry soil, the seeds can germinate and move up through that dry soil. They'll essentially be inactive because the herbicide, as they move through that dry soil, is not available. So let's look at these 5 different herbicides. I have them arranged here in their water solubility: dimethenamid, s-metolachlor, and prosulfocarb, which are part of Boxer Gold, pyroxasulfone, which is in Sakura, and trifluralin, which is in Treflan. You can see there's quite a range in the water solubility. The most soluble is dimethenamid, about 1,450 milligrams per liter. S-metolachlor is about 1/3 as soluble as dimethenamid. Prosulfocarb is even less water soluble. It's about 2 orders of magnitude more than, or an order of magnitude less than S-metolachlor. Pyroxasulfone has very, very low water solubility, and trifluralin is the least water soluble. Next to that, I have the KOC, which is as I said, the binding, how well these herbicides bind to the soil. And you can see that except for pyroxasulfone, as the water solubility decreased, the binding to the soil increased. So the dimethenamid bound the least, followed by metolachlor, prosulfocarb, and then trifluralin, which binds very, very tightly. The exception to this rule is pyroxasulfone. although it has very, very low water solubility, its binding to the soil is very similar to dimethenamid and is much less than, say, metolachlor or the other two herbicides. The third column here shows the vapor pressure. And the vapor pressure is a measure of how easy it is for these herbicides to volatilize. The higher the vapor pressure, the more easily it vaporizes or volatilizes from the soil. And this is kind of the reverse of the herbicide solubility, again, except for pyroxasulfone. So of these 5 herbicides, trifluralin has the highest vapor pressure, which means it's the most volatile, followed by the dimethenamid and metolachlor and prosulfocarb. All 3 of these are essentially the same in volatility. And the least volatile is pyroxasulfone. Although it has a very low water solubility, it is very non-volatile. And this is important in order to understand some of the factors affecting pyroxasulfone activity. So let's look at the effect of volatility. If we look at this, we see that trifluralin is greater than prosulfocarb, which is very similar to metolachlor and dimethenamid, and all of these are much greater than pyroxasulfone. This high volatility means that these herbicides, the ones that are highly volatile, need to be incorporated by tillage or rainfall rapidly or very soon after application. And that the herbicide can also be lost from the surface of crop residue. If the crop residue intercepts these herbicides and they're laying on the surface, if they're volatile, they could leave that crop residue surface just through the volatility. The bottom graph here is an example of what happens with a dinitrilaniline. I don't have trifluralin, but pendimethalin is very similar. This was a field study that we did here in Colorado where we applied the herbicide at day 0, and then we watched to see what happened with the herbicide over time. And in this case, we didn't get the water on quite as rapidly as we would have, and it wasn't physically incorporated, so that by 3 days after application, you can see that we lost about 60% of the herbicide had been lost, and this loss is due to volatility. And then after that, after it was incorporated, the loss was much slower. But this shows the necessity, particularly for trifluralin, to get it incorporated as rapidly as possible so that you don't lose it through this volatility. The second thing that we can look at, which is the KOC, is the soil binding. And again, we see that trifluralin binds the most, followed by prosulfocarb, metolachlor, and then dimethenamid and pyroxasulfone, which bind the least and are very equivalent. What does this soil binding mean? First, it means that the greater the soil binding, the less leaching, the less movement of these herbicides in the soil environment or soil profile. So trifluralin and prosulfocarb, which have very, very tight binding to the soil, do not leach very deeply into the soil. They essentially stay in the top 1 to 2 centimeters. And thus, if you're looking at crop injury with these particular herbicides, what you need to do is make sure that the crop seed does not come in contact, and as long as it's below the treated layer, the herbicides are not going to leach into that seed zone. Metolachlor, dimethenamid, and pyroxasulfone, on the other hand, can leach. And what this means is that excessive rainfall, and I'm talking about many millimeters of rainfall after application, with these 3 herbicides, excessive rainfall can leach these herbicides below the weed seed zone and into the crop seed zone. And what that means, or what the result is that you can lose your weed control because you've moved the herbicide, say, out of the top 2.5 to 4 centimeters, and you can move it into the crop seed zone, which is generally below that in the 7.5 or 5 to 7.5 centimeter zone. And what that means is you're going to lose weed control, but you have an increased instances or possibility of crop damage or crop response. This is an example of what precipitation and the relationship between precipitation and herbicide movement. What we have here are 2 different years. Again, this was field work. In 2009 and 2010, we were comparing the movement of pyroxasulfone and s-metolachlor, and these were fairly light sandy loam soils. And in 2009, you can see that we had very sporadic, even though these were irrigated, it was very sporadic irrigation, and there wasn't a lot of irrigation, as opposed to 2010, where particularly this point here where right after application, we had a tremendous rainfall event. We had about 70 centimeters or 70 millimeters of rainfall occurred over about a 3-day period. Plus, we had more rain through the season. And if we look at the distribution, here we have depth zone at 0 to 7.5, 7.5 to 15, 15 to 22.5, and 22.5 to 30 centimeters deep in the soil profile. In 2009, when we looked at the distribution of the herbicides, both pyroxasulfone and s-metolachlor, throughout the season, greater than 90% of it stayed within that 0 to 7.5 zone, soil zone. So there was very, very little limited movement down the profile. Contrast that to 2010, especially since we had this very high rainfall event right after application. Here, almost 45% of the pyroxasulfone moved out of that top 7.5 centimeters and moved deeper into the soil profile, so that we had about 25% of it in the 7.5 to 15 centimeter range and about another 15% in the 15 to 22.5%. Metolachlor also moved down. Only about 25 or 77% of it remained in the upper profile, and we moved it further down. But you can also see the difference in the herbicide or the soil binding of these between these two soils. Pyroxasulfone is bound less tightly to the soil, and so there was more movement of it in this particular experiment than s-metolachlor. But what this data really shows is the effect that rainfall can have on herbicide movement in the soil, particularly with the acid anilins or the pyroxasulfone. The other factor, make sure I haven't missed something here. The other factor that's very important to understand the behavior of these these 5 herbicides is how they interact with surface or crop residue. It's been known that surface residue affects herbicidal efficacy, and it can do this in multiple ways. One, it's just a physical interception of the herbicide before it reaches the soil surface. And so if you have a lot of residue, when you spray it, the herbicide can be bound or can be intercepted by the residue and not reach the soil. But it's not lost because of that. The herbicide can then be washed off of that residue with rainfall after application. But how much of it washes off depends on the affinity of the herbicide for the surface residue. And that determines how fast it will wash off or how much will wash off. And in addition, the volatility and the photostability of these herbicides will determine how much could be lost from this residue surface before a rainfall event. This is just a slide showing that the correlation between the percent crop cover or ground cover and how much herbicide is intercepted. And you can see that as the crop cover or the ground cover increases, the amount of residue or the amount of interception increases in a pretty much linear fashion, although it's not one-to-one. Here we had about 90% surface cover, and we had about 55% interception. But it does show the physical effect of the crop residue on herbicide interception. If we look at the ability of these herbicides to bind to this surface residue or crop residue, we find that trifluralin and prosulfocarb bind very, very tightly to surface residue. And in fact, so tightly that what is bound to the surface residue is essentially taken out of the system. These do not readily wash off of the surface residue or the crop residue. Metolachlor and dimethenamid peroxysulfone, on the other hand, can wash off the surface residue. How much of it's bound depends on the crop residue. In this part here, we're looking at residue from different types of crops and different parts of the crop. We looked at sorghum, wheat, and maize. In the sorghum, we looked at the stem, the head, and the leaves. These are dead plants or what's left at the end of the season, or the stem in wheat, or the stem crop and leaves in maize. And one thing you can see here is that in sorghum, that the amount of binding, and this is just strict binding, how tightly can this residue bind the herbicide, that metolachlor binds more tightly to the residue than peroxysulfone, but it depends on the type of residue and where the residue comes from. So that we see with pyroxasulfone and sorghum residue, it binds most tightly to the stem and less tightly to the head and leaves. On the wheat, we just had the stem, and in the maize, again, it was most tightly to the stem, very little to the cobs or to the leaves. Metolachlor, on the other hand, shows a similar trend, but not quite as great. And in fact, when we looked at the stem, cobs, and leaves of maize, we actually found a slightly tighter, well, it's about the same between stem and leaves. But it does show that both of these herbicides can bind to the residue if you just put it on there and see how easily it's washed off. But then how easily can these herbicides be washed from the residue? And as I said, trifluralin and prosulfocarb are not washed from the residue with rainfall. Metolachlor, dimethenamid, and pyroxasulfone can be washed from the residue, and it doesn't necessarily take a lot of volume. You can see with pyroxasulfone we had 5, 10, and 20 millimeters of simulated rainfall, and with each increase we got an increased amount washed off, but even with 5 millimeters, about 55% of what was on the residue washed off. Metolachlor, for whatever reason, washed off even more readily, so that we had even more, anywhere from 70 to 85% or 84% of it washed off the residue with these, or washed off the crop residue with these different levels of rainfall. But it does show that these herbicides can be washed off the residue. The other factor you have to consider is how much is lost from the residue before a rainfall event. In this particular case, we had sorghum and wheat, 2 different residues. We applied the herbicides on the residue, and then we left it sitting in the greenhouse for 7 days before we did a simulated rainfall. And we determined how much herbicide was remaining from the time of when it was applied to what was washed off or what we could recover after this 7-day period. And we found with pyroxasulfone, whether it's sorghum or wheat, we could get back 100% of it. All of it that was there was still there after 7 days. That was not the case for metolachlor. We lost anywhere from 20 to 35% of it was physically lost. And the reason probably for this is metolachlor has a higher volatility. As I showed in a previous slide, that metolachlor is probably 3 orders of magnitude more volatile than pyroxasulfone. And this volatility allowed it to essentially vaporize off of that crop residue. And so even though it's easily washed off, you may lose some of the herbicide over time due to this volatility. And we know that crop residue can reduce activity. Research reports in the literature, stuff that is done and been done in Australia, shows that 1 ton per hectare of residue can decrease the activity of prosulfocarb by up to 60%, and with trifluralin up to 50%. And if you had heavier residue, these numbers would be greater. So it does show that if you have heavy residue with these particular herbicides, you're going to have an increased rate to get. The final factor that I want to look at is just the relative rates of dissipation. If we rank these 5 herbicides, we would say that dimethenamid and prosulfocarb are degraded or dissipated the most rapidly, with half-lives of anywhere from 18 to 20 days. This is just average numbers. Metolachlor, followed by metolachlor and trifluralin, which are more in the 20 to 40-day range, and then followed by pyroxasulfone, which of all these 5 herbicides probably dissipates the most slowly, anywhere with a half-life of 40 to 60 days. So what that means is that these herbicides will dissipate more rapidly, so you won't get as long a residual activity out of these herbicides as you would out of, say, pyroxasulfone, which would give you the longest residual activity. So what is the practical recommendation? What are the consequences of these various things that I just talked about? Well, let's just go through them one by one. One is trifluralin, and we've already talked about this, and most of you already know this. Its high volatility means it needs to be incorporated very soon or immediately after application, either by mechanical means or by rainfall. Any delay in incorporation after application will result in rapid loss of the herbicide from the soil surface due to its volatility. Also, trifluralin will bind very tightly to surface residue and will not wash off easily, if at all, with rainfall. So if you have a field with very heavy crop residue, then more herbicide will be needed to give the same level of weed control as if you had a crop light crop residue. These are main factors. It's also said that because trifluralin binds very tightly to the soil, it will not leach, and therefore to protect the crop from trifluralin, separating the herbicide from the soil or from the seed will be a very effective means of protecting the crop. Now, if we look at Boxer Gold, it's an interesting compound because it's a mixture of two, prosulfocarb and metolachlor, and I've already shown how these two have very different soil interactions. Moderate volatility of both of these means that they also should be incorporated soon after application, and delay incorporation could result in loss of herbicide activity, but it's not as sensitive as something like trifluralin. Both of these herbicides require water for activation, and delay in rainfall, I showed you, could result in less weed control. Again, this is not as necessarily as important as trifluralin because it actually gets into the weed seeds or emergent seedlings as a vapor. So it's not as sensitive to water as, say, prosulfocarb or metolachlor. Prosulfocarb, on the other hand, will bind very, very tightly to the surface, to the soil, and also to surface residue or crop residue, and will not wash off readily with rainfall. So if you have heavy residue, the prosulfocarb component of Boxer Gold may be less effective than you would imagine. On the other hand, metolachlor will wash off the surface residue with rainfall. Although the other caveat is that we know that metolachlor can also be lost from surface residue if it stays on the surface residue for a long time, say 7 to 14 days before a rainfall. So you could also lose activity. As I said, heavy residue will decrease the activity of prosulfocarb, and you may need more herbicide under heavy residues to maintain activity. The effect of rainfall, besides needing rainfall in order to activate the herbicides, the other side of the coin is heavy rainfall, although it will not move prosulfocarb, so that a separation of keeping the prosulfocarb treated soil away from the seed will protect the crop seed. Metolachlor, on the other hand, under heavy rainfall, can leach and can move down out of the weed seed zone and into the crop seed zone, and you could get more crop response under heavy rainfall right after application. Dimethenamid, again, it's similar to metolachlor in its volatility, so the same thing means for incorporation, and any delay in incorporation could result in loss of herbicide through volatility. It also requires water for activation, but it's not as sensitive as metolachlor. Because it's more water soluble, it will be more available quicker with lower amounts of water. Dimethenamid will also wash off crop residue, but it could be lost by volatility if it remains on the surface for a long time, very similar to metolachlor. And heavy rainfall, particularly for dimethenamid, can leach the dimethenamid more readily than it will metolachlor. Dimethenamid and pyroxasulfone are going to act very similar to that below the weed seed zone and into the crop seed zone, resulting in more crop response and more crop injury and less weed control. Sorry. Finally, pyroxasulfone. Pyroxasulfone is a compound that's very interesting. It is non-volatile, so it is not as sensitive to timing of incorporation as the other herbicides. It can remain on a dry soil for a period of time and sit there and not be lost from the system through volatility. But it does require water for activation. And if you had weed seeds, it will germinate below the dry soil and come up through dry soil. I showed how pyroxasulfone, although it's not as sensitive as metolachlor because it is more water, or it's more available, could result in less weed control. Pyroxasulfone will also wash off the crop residue, but unlike metolachlor or dimethenamid, it's not lost from the surface residue over time because it is non-volatile. However, heavy rainfall can leach pyroxasulfone, and it will leach it more readily than it will leach metolachlor, moving it below the weed seed zone and into the crop seed zone, and this could result in increased crop injury and less weed control. So that's all I have to say today, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Erica, whoever, and I'll be happy to ask any or answer any questions you may have.